Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I endorse the comments from the Chair of the Committee? And I'm happy to say again that I respect the way in which Mr Borrows chairs that committee. It's got a lot of work and he does that task very effectively. I think there was a slip of the tongue when he said that the genesis of the bill was with the National Party. Actually, that wasn't correct. It was a bill that was introduced originally by Clayton Cosgrove as the Prime Minister. I'm happy to record as the Prior Speaker on behalf of the Labour Party that the Labour Party will be supporting this bill. It does update the legislation around private security personnel and private investigators. That's important. There have been changes since the original private security legislation in the 1970s. There's a lot more quasi-police functions that are conducted now by private security agents that used to be the time in the 1970s. Actually, if people think back to the 1970s, in those days the people that provided security at public sporting events and things were the police. Now the police generally aren't the main provider of security services at big public functions, be they sporting matches or cultural events. It's actually generally contracted out to private security people and there's a need for legislation to catch up with that reality. The only area that I disagree with the government in respect of this bill is the restoration or the granting of the right for security personnel to take photographs and to conduct other surveillance operations. Now, everyone on both sides of the House agrees that it is somewhat nonsensical at the moment that a private person can take a photograph in circumstances that under the status quo of the existing legislation a private security person can't. And that does seem a nonsense, and that should be fixed. But the more difficult, the more fundamental problem that we have is that in New Zealand at the moment we have a bit of a gap in the law. We have a gap in the law where we have controls on how state agencies conduct surveillance operations, including taking photographs of people, and yet we don't have constraints on non-state agencies. So we've got powers in favour of the police to go about the things that they need to do investigating crimes, but there are constraints on them doing things. In certain situations they have to get warrants before they can conduct those search and surveillance operations. We have no such constraints in respect of non-state agency search and surveillance. The Law Commission has identified this as being a gap in the New Zealand law, and they've said, when they developed the private, or when they were involved in submissions or the development of, I'm not sure which, of the Private Security Personnel and Private Investigators Bill, that we ought not to confer the right on private investigators to take photographs until we tidied up the underlying law relating to photographs and surveillance and searches by non-state agencies, because it's a nonsense that the agencies, the state agencies that we confer these special powers on, face some controls at law that are not applied to non-state agencies. And I gave the example when we were in the committee stage or the prior stage of the bill, I forget which, of the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Bill English, having to suffer intrusions of people taking photographs from the street inside his children's bedroom. And they were taking photographs of his children's bedrooms. Now, there were problems in the underlying dispute that I don't think that Bill English was free from fault in. But in my view, Bill English and his family ought not to have suffered the intrusion of people taking photographs from the street into his bedroom or into his children's bedroom. That is an infringement of his civil liberties that is not justified. And I've suffered in my time as a minister similar action, in my case by private investigators who were stupid enough to out themselves on TV. And there's no doubt that those private investigators were at being paid for by the exclusive brethren, following and investigating me, Michael Cullen and David Benson Pope, and probably Peter Davis and the Prime Minister as well. And this was admitted by a private investigator who forgot the word private and did a public interview, which was a silly acknowledgement, but it did show that there are actually intrusions into the civil liberties of me, every other member of Parliament, and every member of the public in New Zealand that are not properly controlled by our current laws. Now, private investigators, as a general rule, should have no greater power than any other private individual. They should have the same powers as private individuals, and I agree it's a nonsense that they can't take photos, but they shouldn't have any further powers than private individuals. And I agreed with the logic that was being used by the Law Commission when they recommend that we stick with the status quo in respect of private investigators not being able to take photographs and do other surveillance work until we properly control search and surveillance by non-state agencies. Because the problem that we will now create, or we risk creating by this legislation, is that when the Law Commission comes up with their final recommendations as to what are appropriate controls on search and surveillance by non-governmental agencies, i.e. by private people and by private investigators, then the private investigators are going to stick up their hand and they're going to say, we're special, we need more rights than the general public, or they'll come along and they'll say, the general public needs these rights too. And I disagree with that. I do not think that that it was right that anyone, be it a private investigator or someone out on the street, can stick a camera from a distance, and these are new issues that come to us as a consequence of new technologies, and those new technologies include not just cameras that are powerful from a distance, but directional microphones, tracking devices that can be put on cars, heat detection equipment that shows where people are. There are new technologies around that allow significant intrusions into the private lives of people that ought not to be freely able to be used by busybodies. And I think it was an absolute outrage that the privacy of Bill English and the privacy of his children was infringed in the way it was by taking photographs from the public street through the bedroom windows of his house. And that is something that is properly controlled to protect the civil liberties of all of us to actually live private lives and not have that intruded upon unduly. So there will be legislation that will eventually come to this House at the recommendation of the Minister of Justice, at the recommendation of the Law Commission, which puts some control against inappropriate intrusion into our private lives. And you betcha those private investigators, because we're giving them these powers in the meantime, and this legislation will come along and they'll say, we're special, don't include us. And that's the point of principle that I think is wrong in this version of the bill. The bill that went to Select Committee said, let's just stick with the status quo. Let's just stick with the status quo and put up with this nonsensical part of the law that says that private investigators can't take photographs and do surveillance without the consent of the occupant of the property. We all agree that that's imperfect legislation, but it's imperfect legislation that we've had for 36 years. And another couple of years of that imperfection would not have done much harm. But what it would have done is actually sent the signal, firstly, that we don't think that private investigators should have any more powers than private people, because they are effectively just agents of private people. You think about what a private investigator does is they actually stand in the shoes of the private person who employs them. They're actually doing things on behalf of private people. They shouldn't have any more powers than private people should have to do what they do themselves. And if you need any more powers than that to investigate a crime or something, you do it through the police. And then there are the constraints around getting a warrant, convincing a judge that it's an appropriate thing to do, evidential requirements that are enforced by the courts as to an appropriate use of police powers, all those sorts of constraints, and indeed political accountability of the Minister of Police if the police overstep the mark. None of those sorts of constraints are in play in respect of private investigators, and that's why private investigators ought not to have more powers than ordinary people, and that's why, in my opinion, we are creating a rod for our own back in respect of that particular provision. Having said that, it is good legislation overall. I hope that, that in this debate we have appropriately highlighted the risk that we create in respect of those non-governmental search and surveillance powers, and that we, in the future, tidy that up for everyone, including in respect of private investigators. Thank you, Mr.